So now I'm going to show you how I built this Imperial bunker from scratch. Just using cardboard, cardstock, a bit of MDF, and that ever so lovely drywall tape. So stay watching to see how you can make this in a day or less. So I have my Stormtrooper for scale. I've got single corrugated cardboard. I'm cutting out the front. I've measured the size of the door, exactly how big I want it, 3 inches, and either side of that is 1.5 inches. And then I measure out the back. That came out to be 10 inches long, and all of these pieces are 2 inches tall. And then I'm trying to get an idea of how wide I want it. I end up going with 7 inches. And that allows us to have a lot of those armor platings on the outside. And they're going to just be made with chipboard rectangles. How crazy that that gives so much detail. And now the Imperial bunker has a slight angle to it. It is wide at the base and slowly goes up. So I'm measuring that here, and I end up with 1/2 inch removed from the top. And I do that to all the pieces. In the end, probably shouldn't have done it to the back because it also angles outwards as it goes backwards. So that means the angle will be different at the back. I'm not quite sure on the maths to get the angle exactly correct, so I just filled it up with hot glue to make sure that it stayed in the right shape when I went to go put it on the MDF base. So I've marked out the angle that I want the front door to open in, and because the door is actually inset into the Imperial bunker, I've cut a couple of rough guides just to hold the structure together while I glue everything. And then later on, when we come in and put the inset and add the door, we'll get rid of those front beams and it will just be a flat wall. And then, as I said, just absolutely filling it up with hot glue, making sure not to burn my fingers. So here, these pieces are for the inset at the front door, and I've marked that with the same angle, coming in 1/2 inch at the top. This angle didn't end up being correct, and I had to put a lot of hot glue again. And these inset, I'm pretty sure, was about 1.5 inches. That way it gives plenty of space for a miniature to stand in the little alcove opening, like we see in episode 6. And here I'm marking out the door to go at the end of that alcove. Originally, I was going to leave this and just paint it like a door, but the ability to remove the door adds a lot to the playability of the model. This little piece still worked really good to hold the entire structure together while I was working on the exterior, adding those armor platings, and building the roof. And here's chipboard. We're going to use that for the armor plating. The armor plating I made 1.5 inches by 1/2 inch, so it's just wider than a model. I wasn't too sure on the size going in, but this estimate paid off in the long run, and it looks really good. So, for the pillars in between the armor plating, I really wanted them to stand out and be exaggerated. So these are 1/4 inch pieces of foam, and I've just lined them up so that in between them is 1.5 inches, just enough to fit those armor plates. So now just using some thicker cardstock, I'm making a template for those corner pieces. And later on, I'll cut those out of chipboard to give them the strength that they need. Now because I plan to base this and surround it with dirt and bushes, I don't really need to be too careful about the bottom because that'll get covered up. Now because the armor plates have a bit of a tilt to them, I've used a barbecue skewer here so I can place the bottom armor plate on top of that and then stack the rest of them on top of that. So I'm coming in here with the bottom armor plate, sticking that on with PVA glue. And with all the bottom ones on, I can now easily go through and stack all of the armor plates on. I first go through one panel, stack up 5, and that way I know where to place all of the other panels in relation to that first one. As I'm going through, I'm noticing some bodgy cuts with the armor plates. So I'm just placing the best side down to the bottom, and that'll be the side that's exposed. So any of the bad cuts will be hidden by the plate above it. And then, thanks to movie magic, all 4 sides are done, and it's time to get started on the roof. So I've put the entire structure upside down on a piece of chipboard, using some blue tack to hold it in place and mark out the inner edge. Then, 2 centimeters out from the inner edge, I mark lines, and that's where I'll cut, because the roof of the Imperial bunker hangs out ever so slightly over the top of the building. Using a metal ruler and taking multiple passes at it with the blade ensures a nice clean cut on the chipboard. Once I ensured the roof was the right size, I added multiple small foam pieces in the corners, and that'll make sure that the roof doesn't topple around or slide off during play. After all of that, the roof was a bit too thin for my liking. So I got some single corrugated cardboard and stacked that on top. And then that still ended up being a bit too thin for me. So I added another layer of the cardboard. I then cut strips of corrugation cladding out of the old chipboard. This served to hide the corrugation of the cardboard and also to add another layer of detail. And when I went through and dry brushed with silver, these edges caught and looked really nice. I also cut these big plates out of the same chipboard, and they'll just go on the roof to add a bit more variety. So it's not just a barren, flat roof. Now with the roof done and drying, I started gluing the entire structure onto this old MDF base. And the edges of this MDF are just chamfered ever so slightly to give a bit more of a natural flow onto the table. And then I just filled all the edges up with this mixture of multiple grains of sand, let that dry, and painted it up to look like dirt. Then I went back to the door. I cut the same size angles from these little pieces of foam and placed 2 pieces of chipboard in between this and the back. And that way you could slide a door down and it wouldn't rattle around or become unlodged. Cut out a piece of chipboard that'll fit down that slot and just marked roughly where the door edges would meet. so that way I could line up my detail work to fit. And then this is just pieces of cardstock cut to 1/4 of an inch, and I'm using this to make the banding, the sort of metal banding we see on the interior door. I then laid out some of that drywall tape for the instant floor. Now, if I was thinking a bit ahead, I would have done this over the entire piece of MDF before I even glued anything on, and it would just look perfectly fine. But now I'm fiddling around trying to work it in, and it's a bit of a task, but it lines up pretty nice. And use some coffee stir sticks to add just metal banding around the edges where it doesn't look too great, and that'll hide those mistakes. I then clad any exposed corrugation with pieces of paper, painted on a couple layers of Mod Podge and black paint, and completely covered the thing in grey. Came through with a light dry brush of silver and a few splotches of green to show the age of this thing, and coming through with my homemade flock along the edges, and a little bit of wash on the interior to make it look like it's worn and old. You could fit any sort of thing in here. I left it open so that way I could use it for D&D or Star Wars Legion, and I could mix and match some different scatter terrain on the interior. And here's the door, painted the banding in silver, didn't add any control panels or anything, you can just add that as like little scatter later on. That way it can be used in any sort of setting. And for having no plan at the beginning of the day, and at the end a completely finished model, I'd say that's pretty good. So don't ever be scared just to start making something, and see where your mind takes you.